So good morning, everybody. You're all very welcome to this month's edition of the Neurodiversity Masterclass series. And we'll be getting going in about 1 or 2 minutes. Just see there's a few people just coming in through our digital front door. So just give everybody an opportunity to sit down, be comfortable, and have a cup of coffee, tea, whatever you're having yourself. And we'll get going in about 1 or 2 minutes. So good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Kilbride. I'm the CEO of ADHD Ireland, and you're very welcome to this edition of our Neurodiversity Masterclass series, which is a broad range of topics from world-class speakers on neurodiverse individuals and advocates and researchers and employers from around the globe. And if you're new to this, you're particularly welcome today. And as I say, that is the Masterclass series. How did it get developed? And we've been running events here in Ireland in partnership with a range of organisations, including the University of UCD and Maynooth University, and we've been running in-person conferences for a number of years. And so back in about 2019, 2020, we were saying, how can we keep this alive and keep the information coming forward? Great having these one-day conferences, everybody comes along, goes away with lots of stuff. But how can we keep the conversation moving forward? And out of that came the Masterclass series, which, as I say, over those number of years, we've had a range of, literally world-class speakers in the area of neurodiversity. As I say, it's brought by a partnership of UCD, which is the University College Dublin, and NUIM, which is the University of Maynooth, and ADHD Ireland, the Institute of Neurodiversity, Untapped, and Neurodiversity, which will be organisations from Australia. Just to let you know, in terms of the running order for today, we're very happy that Sandra and Thom Jones will be here to give a presentation. The presentation will run for about 30 minutes approx, might be a little bit over, a little bit shorter. And after that, we'll go into some Q&A. And obviously, we do encourage you to engage with the event here today. So if you do want to pop something into the chat, that's fine. But just remember, the chat is for the chat. And we would ask people not to promote services and other things like that as well, or give advice. If you do have a question for Sandra at any particular time, please drop it into the Q&A because we can't take them out of the chat and put them into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, any particular time, comments, questions, just looking for some more information, whatever happens to be, please drop it into the Q&A. And they say we do hope to finish about 10 o'clock in the morning. Just for people that normally attend, we normally would have these events at 5 o'clock on the last Thursday of every month. But it is neurodiversity. We do need to take in differences into account. And so we can't run everything at a time zone that works for ADHD Ireland. And so again, we're very happy that Sandra's coming here. And just to let everybody know, Sandra's coming from Australia. And it's about 6 o'clock there in the evening. And so Professor Sandra Thom is an MBA, MPH, PhD, is an autistic author, artist, and an academic and advocate. And she's an author of Growing into Autism, which was published in 2022, Autistic in Academia, and has just recently published in the last week, Autistics at Work. And Sandra's worked for more than 2 decades in the university sector as a researcher and senior leader, and most recently as Pro Vice Chancellor Research Impact at ACU, which I believe is in Canberra. She now works as a consultant providing a range of services for autistic people, as well as professional development, research, consultancy services for education, employment and healthcare providers through her website, Autistic Professor. Sandra is also honorary professor at the University of Wollongong. And so thank you very much, and we really appreciate Sandra coming here today to take your time to do the presentation, and we look forward to receiving your presentation over the next half an hour or so.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about cross-neurotype communication in the workplace, which is something that many of us find challenging. Well, I know I certainly do. So thanks for listening to me, and I will try very hard to stick to the 30 minutes, although I am a bit of a talker, I have to confess. Whoops, helps if my thing moves. I want to start by clearly stating that the communication problems that we experience in the workplace and in many other contexts are because autistic people communicate differently from non-autistic people. It's not that we communicate badly or that we communicate incorrectly, but rather that we're typically in the minority. So because our communication style is not the norm, it's often seen as the problem rather than recognizing that it's just that we're different to neurotypical people. And everyone here will be very familiar with the double empathy problem, that phenomenon that autistic people communicate easily with other autistic people, just as non-autistic people, so they tell me, communicate easily with other non-autistic people. But problems arise when the two neurotypes communicate with each other, which is what I want to talk about today. And this was illustrated really well in a study of communication chains, the technical term for the telephone game. And this was a study where they got groups of 8 people matched by neurotype, so either all autistic people or all non-autistic people, or mixed groups. First person's told a story and they repeat it to the next person, who repeats it to the next person. And what they found was that there was absolutely no difference between the all autistic group and the all non-autistic group in the amount and the accuracy of information that was transmitted, all the way to the 8th person. Both groups were equally effective. But where it went wrong was when they had the mixed groups. You put autistic and non-autistic people in the same group, they retained less information, and they also reported lower levels of rapport between the participants. And that's just a game, it's just an experimental study, but it actually is a really good example of what happens in the workplace, because we do have those communication breakdowns, and unfortunately we also have the lower levels of rapport, which is a big issue for many of us at work. And as I said before, because we're in the minority, we're often seen as being at fault for those communication breakdowns. So if there is a lack of communication between an autistic person and a non-autistic person, and any autistic people here today will know this, and I've certainly experienced it myself in the workplace, the typical response is, oh, that communication broke down because that autistic person has problems communicating. For me, that's really the big thing that we need to get across in workplaces. It's not that we as autistic people have problems with communication. It's that there was a breakdown because of the two different ways of communicating. But unfortunately, because we're in the minority, there is also that expectation that we will learn and we will imitate neurotypical communication styles. So we are expected to learn to talk like neurotypical people without regard for the fact that basically what we're being asked to do is to mask and to act like someone we're not, in order to make it easier for other people to communicate. And I like to think of it using an analogy. So imagine the workplace is Canada, right? So some people speak French or neurotypical, and some people speak English or autistic. Now, in the real Canada, people accept that neither language is better or more correct than the other one. Right? So both groups of people in Canada, people learn a bit of English and a bit of French, whichever is your natural language. You learn enough of the other's language to communicate at least at a functional level. And people take equal responsibility for communication breakdowns. So the English speaker doesn't blame the French speaker for a communication breakdown. They say, okay, our languages are different. But also, in the real Canada, all the street signs, store names, menus, public information, it's in both languages, in recognition that both languages are valid and everyone actually needs to understand what's going on. But in workplace Canada, all the signs are in French. All the instructions are in French, and the people who speak English, that's us autistic people, we have to just figure things out. There's an expectation, well, if we don't speak neurotypical, we just have to catch up. And that's what life feels like for a lot of autistic people in the workplace, and a lot of people with other forms of neurodiversity in the workplace. This expectation that we're just not quick enough, we're just not smart enough, we need to catch up and learn the neurotypical way of communicating and existing. So I just want to go through different aspects of communication and how that sort of plays out. So the first one is oral communication, and I use the term oral communication deliberately, not verbal, because I'm talking about spoken words, not which is oral, not verbal communication, which actually refers to all communication using words. So a lot of non-speaking people do use verbal communication. They just don't articulate those words out loud. So some of the challenges in this area, speaking patterns. Many autistic people have different speech patterns from non-autistic norms. So that might mean speaking slowly, because a lot of us need more time to process information, to formulate ideas, to respond to questions. And often we're not given time to do that. So if you think about in a meeting or in a job interview, which is where a lot of us come unstuck, they ask a question. If we don't answer quickly and we don't articulate our whole sentence very quickly, then we're seen as poor communicators. Some of us speak very quickly. I'm a good example of that. I was reminding myself, slow down. We rapidly express our thoughts and ideas. We don't pause between sentences. We just race ahead and throw everything out there. A lot of autistic people may have disfluent speech, so stuttering or cluttering or other disfluencies or intermittent speech, sometimes being able to speak, sometimes not having access to words. So there's a whole range of things in our speaking patterns that are different to non-autistic people. And why is speaking slowly or fast or disfluent, why is it wrong? It's just wrong because it's different, not because it's actually faulty. A lot of autistic people have a different speaking tone. So we may have limited variation in speaking tone. So a flat or monotone speech, or speak in a sing-song voice, or have another non-typical speaking tone. And one of the things that I've learned, and many of us have learned, is that non-autistic people place a lot of emphasis on tone in the way that they interpret spoken language. So those rises and falls in tone are seen as indications of emotional reactions, of emphasis, of intent. And we can be really misunderstood due to that lack of tonal variation. So if our voice doesn't go up and down in the right places, people think we're not interested in the conversation, or if our tonal variation isn't connected to meaning. So I know that's something I've worked on a lot, and I talk to my son about this a lot because he has the same issue, that sometimes our tone sounds to a neurotypical person as grumpy or happy or upset, and we didn't mean that. Our tone just did what it did. So sometimes we can be misunderstood because our tonal variation is different. But it can also impact the way that we understand non-autistic communication, because we may not perceive the changes in tone in other people's speech and don't interpret cues that other people are sending. So, I find that often really tricky in the workplace, because people use words, neurotypical people often use words that aren't actually what they mean, and we're supposed to pick up from the tone of their voice that they actually meant something quite different to what they said. And if you're not sensitive to those tones, if you don't pick up that tone actually meant something different to the words, it can cause real communication breakdowns. Speaking volume, some of us find it difficult to recognize and regulate the volume of their voice. So speaking very quietly or speaking very loudly. I'm definitely in the latter category. I often get told, shh, you're very loud, speak quietly. The upside of that is you put me in a room and ask me to talk, I never need a microphone. Literal language is something it's probably one of the most commonly recognized characteristics of autistic communication. You talk to people about autistic people and they'll say, oh yes, autistic people are very literal. But I think that's often misunderstood, and its importance in the workplace overlooked. Because when you read these classic descriptions of autistic people and they talk about literal language, they talk about humor. Autistic people have a lack of ability to detect and utilize humor. And I actually don't think that's true. I know a lot of autistic people who are actually really good at humor. And if you look at the number of really successful autistic comedians, you know that that's true, right? Autistic people can be really funny and they can detect humor in other people. But often we can have challenges in the workplace with detecting and understanding figurative language and implied meaning, which can make interpreting and following instructions in the workplace difficult. Because again, non-autistic people are often very indirect in their language. Now, throughout my presentation, I'm going to throw in some quotes, some examples of miscommunication. I've been very deliberate here, and I've used examples of my own communication failures rather than sharing other people's personal information, because I'm quite happy to share that sometimes I get it wrong. So when I was writing my book, Autistics at Work, I wanted to understand not just what it's like to be an autistic person in the workplace, but I also wanted to understand what it's like for my non-autistic colleagues to work with an autistic person. So I did an anonymous survey. People sent their responses to my research assistant about what their challenges were working with me. So this is an example about that thing that I was talking about, figurative language and hints, you know, when people expect you to pick up on what they're saying without actually saying it. So this is an example from one of the people in my team who was talking about how, you know, Sandra misses subtle verbal cues. And when I read this quote, I actually remember this happening in this meeting. So this is true. We were in this meeting together, and I was, you know, I had called the meeting. I was the person in charge, I suppose. And she said to me, "Everyone's here. Shall we begin?" Now, the question to me was, "Shall we begin?" And I said, "Yes, we should." Apparently what she meant was that she thought I should start doing something. I should start chairing the meeting. Now, well, to me, if she'd said, "Sandra, you're the chair, you should start chairing the meeting," I would have done that. But I didn't pick up on that cue, which was apparently to her very obvious in her tone, the way she was looking at me. It wasn't to me. But she learned, and at the next meeting, she said, "Sandra, you're the chair, you need to start chairing," and off we went. So, you know, the communication challenges are about that difference. Another thing that comes up a lot in that cross neurotype communication, many autistic people have a preference for clear, efficient communication, not lots of extra stuff. And that's a very common challenge in the workplace. I don't mean to be critical of neurotypical people. I'm sure they have lots of strengths, but they do tend to bury important information or important instructions in lots of unnecessary conversational padding. So, you know, rather than just saying, "Can you do this?" they come in with a whole bunch of other stuff. And it can make it really difficult to tease out information and determine what's actually required from us. So, you know, they want to give you information and receive information wrapped in this really vague and flowery language. So you get this, you know, nice lengthy thing that sort of says, you know, "How are you?" and "How are things?" and "By the way, can you do this thing?" And I missed the part about "By the way, can you do this thing?" because it's right at the end. But then if I go in and I say, "Can you do X?" or "Could you do Y?" or you ask me a question and I just give you the answer, this can actually cause real conflict in the workplace, because this preference for clear and explicit communication, which is actually intended to facilitate the transfer of information. We're trying to be helpful. We're trying to make sure you get the information that you want, but it's often interpreted as being blunt or rude. And conversely, you know, we just find neurotypical communication sometimes really confusing. Now, some of my non-autistic colleagues find this really challenging, you know, and I agree, this is true. Sometimes the way that I express my thoughts can come across abruptly or opinionated, but then other people find that quite refreshing and say that one of the joys of working with an autistic person is that we're succinct and we're clear and we say exactly what we think. So this to me is one of those really important things about working with an autistic person, or any person really in the workplace, it's about how we understand people's intention, and rather than focusing on what we see as someone's challenges or difficulties, understanding what's behind that, what's the motivation behind it, and recognizing that often when autistic people come across as blunt or rude, they're actually trying to be helpful, they're trying to communicate. And if you recognize that and actually start to see the value in that clear communication, it can really make that interaction in the workplace much more positive for everyone. Related to that is this issue of small talk. I mean, we are often criticized for info dumping. So, you ask me a question about something that I'm interested in and I know a lot about, and I will tell you everything I know. And that's called info dumping. But I think that actually reflects our perspective that communication should be meaningful. We may not always be great at detecting your level of interest in the topic. I have a family member who's very, very passionate about history, and if he starts talking about Napoleon, I'm going to be listening to a conversation about Napoleon for the next couple of hours and trying to stay interested. But we're sharing information that we believe is valuable. But we can often be bemused by what sometimes seems like a really deep interest in small talk amongst non-autistic people. So talking about the weather, asking questions you already know the answer to, or fill a conversation when there's actually so many really important, interesting things that we'd like to share with you, or we'd like you to share with us. And in the workplace, that can result in autistic people being seen as unfriendly because we don't engage in office small talk, or rude because we tackle those important conversations head on and we openly express our opinions. As I said, some people see that as a positive, some people see that as a negative. But I think focusing on that strength, we are open, we are honest, and we are genuinely wanting to share information and to be helpful and have really meaningful, valuable conversation with our colleagues. Now, another aspect that's often tricky is this issue of conversation patterns. Many of us find it difficult to initiate a conversation. So how do we actually join in a conversation? Being unsure like what to say, how do you start the conversation? How do you join in a conversation? I often find that really difficult when you're in one of those group situations, like a networking situation or a informal conversation with colleagues, and people how do you actually join in a conversation? A lot of neurotypical people seem to find that really easy to slide in, whereas a lot of autistic people, such as myself, will stand there kind of thinking, how do I join in? What do I actually say? How do I start this conversation? Understanding the social rules and knowing when it's our turn to speak, that can make continuing a conversation difficult, particularly if we need time to process information and formulate responses. That can be really difficult if you're not a really fast information processor, and sometimes by the time you've come up with your answer to the conversation, it's moved on to somewhere else. But also knowing when and how to end a conversation. And for me, that's one of my greatest conversational challenges. I'm having a conversation with someone and I think, is it finished? Like, do I stop now? Have I gone on too long and the other person's really bored and I need to stop and move away? Or have I stopped too soon and seemed rude and uninterested? And it was really interesting for me, as I mentioned, when I got some feedback from my colleagues, because one of my biggest challenges is phone conversations and trying to know when the phone conversation's finished, like when is it time to say goodbye? And this goes back to that double empathy issue that I was talking about, because this quote from one of my colleagues made me laugh. This was one of my neurotypical colleagues, and her piece of feedback was that it was harder for her to gauge when the phone conversations come to an end than with other people. And I thought, wow, that is double empathy absolutely epitomized, because my neurotypical colleague finds it just as hard to tell when I've finished a conversation as I find it hard to tell when she's finished a conversation. So it really is that. Whereas my autistic friends, when I'm on a phone to one of my autistic friends or colleagues, I know when we finish talking and we can finish, and the same in face-to-face meetings. So it really is about those different communication styles. When we talk about nonverbal communication, there's lots of different aspects of that that are different between autistic and non-autistic people. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with all of this, but I have I have to talk about eye contact because I just have to. In Western culture, looking directly into someone's eyes indicates you're paying attention. It conveys trust and honesty. It builds rapport, helps you understand what the other person's thinking and feeling. That's what all the management gurus tell you. And that's what most non-autistic people believe. And so many of us autistic people grow up right from the time we're little tiny kids being told, look at me when I'm talking to you. But for many autistic people, not everyone, some autistic people are very comfortable with eye contact, but for many of us, it doesn't mean any of those things. It's a really uncomfortable experience that makes it difficult to focus on people's conversation, process what they're saying. And the other thing that's really different between us and neurotypical people is that for many of us, it also provides no insight into what the other person's thoughts and feelings are. So this idea that I make eye contact with you because I look in your face and I can like read your facial expressions and tell whether you're interested or bored or happy or sad. I can't. Your face doesn't tell me anything. But the flip side of that is what you see when you look in my eyes and at what my face is doing is probably isn't giving you anything like an accurate read on my thoughts and feelings either. Because my face is, I don't know what my face is doing, but it's probably not doing what you think it's doing. And it's a real source of communication breakdown. And this, again, a quote from one of my lovely previous staff members. They're very honest and very candid, which I love. Talking about how when she introduces me to people that I just this blank face and it looks like I'm not focused. I'm fidgeting with my I fidget a lot. That's all right. And then afterwards realizing that although I looked completely blank and vague and out of it and I wasn't making eye contact and I was fidgeting, I was actually very aware of the conversation and what's being said. But what people are picking up and perceiving from looking at me is that I'm vague and bored and disinterested. That's not what I mean to convey. I don't know why my face conveys that. It just does. Body language, which is another big part of nonverbal communication. All of the expert textbooks on workplaces will tell you that social communication is nonverbal. If we're allowed to be ourselves, we stand and we sit and we move and we exist in the world so differently from non-autistic people. Many of the things that in a non-autistic world indicate that a person's paying attention, like sitting still, actually require cognitive energy for an autistic person. And in our natural state, we engage in movement behaviors that help us regulate our emotions and our sensory input, repetitive behaviors, stimming. We need to do those things to move our bodies to actually be able to focus, to pay attention, to process information. Stopping autistic people from doing these things, which might be explicitly forbidding them, which is what we often do to little kids, or what we do in the workplace is we make people feel so uncomfortable that they stop. It's like forcing a non-autistic person to stop eating or drinking. We can do it, but it's going to have a really negative impact on our well-being and in the long term on our productivity in the workplace. It's also really important to remember that just like eye contact, our facial expressions and our body language are different from non-autistic people. So a non-autistic person's interpretations of our meaning and our intention from our body language will probably be misleading. And that's common in research, particularly in things like healthcare experiences, that the way that doctors and workplace colleagues interpret our thoughts and our meanings and everything that's going on with us from looking at our body language is often very, very wrong and not at all a clear indication of what we're actually thinking or feeling. And it can be just as hard for us to understand non-autistic people's body language as it is for them to understand ours. And I think it's really important for our neurotypical colleagues to be aware of that, because that, I think, is a huge contributor to this myth that autistic people don't have empathy. Because the reality is we do have empathy. we just experience it and express it in different ways from non-autistic people. Many of us are actually hyper empaths. You know, we absorb other people's emotions and we feel them with the same or greater intensity. But because we don't read neurotypical body language, it means that the subtle cues like facial expressions or sighs or, you know, those sorts of things might not be noticed or interpreted in the way that people expect. And if you want an autistic person to know what you're thinking or feeling, then tell them. And I'm going to show you two quotes now. These are from the same member of staff of mine. So she was talking about these two reflections on me. So from the same person, and I think it's important that these come from the same person. And she's talking about being very heavily pregnant, you know, being at work. Apparently she stumbled and she was feeling a bit teary and was having this emotional reaction, and in her view was representing a fragile, pregnant, emotional woman. And I didn't react. Now, when I read that, I felt awful. I thought, how could I be so heartless? I didn't see it. I didn't see that this person was feeling this. But as she says, once she told me, you know, I do care. But I couldn't see, I didn't read that body language in the way that this non-autistic person thought. But I'm not, it doesn't mean that as an autistic person, I don't have empathy, because this same person went on to say that actually, when I knew what was going on, I was a very understanding and supportive manager who, you know, allowed this person to cope and gave them what they need in the workplace. And I think it's really important for our neurotypical colleagues and staff and managers to understand that we are very empathetic, but we don't read your body language. So assuming we're just going to pick up on what you're thinking, what you're feeling when you're happy, when you're sad, when you're angry, is expecting us to read those signs in French when we only speak English. If you tell us what you want and what you need, we are actually going to care and be supportive human beings and supportive colleagues. I have to mention phone calls, because phone calls are such a big issue for so many autistic people. And I'm sure there are autistic people who enjoy talking on the phone, but for many of us, the phone is an absolutely dreadful piece of office equipment and home equipment. And many of you will know that, you know, if you've got an autistic friend and you ring them and they say, oh no, sorry, my phone was on silent. The ringing of a phone does all kinds of awful things. It triggers our various communication quirks. So, you know, all of those things around, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to talk to this person. I'm going to have to formulate words. I'm going to have to think about what I'm going to say to them. All of those challenges with social interactions. How am I going to start this conversation? How am I going to continue this conversation? How am I going to end this conversation? Our sensory issues, because suddenly the phone's making a noise and I wasn't expecting a noise and it's very loud. And our discomfort with unexpected changes or interruptions. So if I'm in the flow and I'm working and my phone rings, that just is going to throw me completely. So phone calls can be really, really disruptive, you know, and one of the things that I've found so helpful in the workplace is when my colleagues understand that and they schedule phone calls, or they give me advance notice that they're going to make phone calls, and they don't just ring me out of the blue and say, hey, can I just ask you a question about X? Because they know that if they do that, they're not going to actually get a helpful answer, because it's just such a big jump from me from where I was to be able to focus and have that conversation. They're going to get a much better response if they email me or they let me know they want to have that conversation. And for many of us, making a phone call isn't much more enjoyable. You know, I have a to-do list that's really long. And, you know, if my to-do list includes, you know, make a 30-second phone call and write a 500-page report, the 500-page report's going to keep going to the top and the phone call's going to keep going to the bottom, because making phone calls is awkward and difficult. I'm not going to talk a lot about written communication, because I'm keen to stick to our timeline and leave plenty of time for questions. And a lot of what I've said about verbal communication also applies to written communication. So I will focus on two key issues that commonly arise in the workplace in relation to written communication. The first one is clarity. As I mentioned before, many autistic people struggle with interpreting vague or ambiguous language. And I know that I have so often read emails from my non-autistic colleagues and found myself sitting there wondering what they actually wanted me to do. So, a common example is someone sends you a document and they say, "Can you look over this for me?" I sit there thinking, what do you actually want me to do? Like, what does look over it mean? Do you want me to skim it and tell you it's great? Or do you want me to do a content read and suggest a few little corrections? Or do you want me to do a really thorough review and provide comprehensive feedback and edit and fix all the grammar and the typos? And I don't know how often I get that wrong, right? They give me this thing and they say, "Can you have a look at it?" And I take it home and I spend the whole evening working through and I pick up all the typos and then I give it back. And I've heard their feelings because they thought it was great and they just wanted me to say, "Oh, it was great." Or I skim it and I say it was great and they say, "Oh, I was really hoping for some more detailed feedback." If you want an autistic person to do something, be really clear what it is that you want us to do, and particularly in written communications. And remember, we don't read between lines typically extremely well. And often in neurotypical communication, there is a lot more between the lines than what's actually written in them. Brevity. And I've got their brevity or not, because I think many autistic people fall into one of two camps, and I think this is a lot to do with us trying to avoid those communication challenges. Some autistic people, and I'm in this category, we write really concise emails. They consist of a question that we need answered or the answer to one that you pose to them, and we don't put lots of information in there besides that. We just, here's the information. And really bemused by this neurotypical practice of embedding important information in unnecessary padding. I can think of many occasions where I've skimmed through an email from a colleague, filed it away, because it sort of talks about this and this, and there's a meeting and so on, this happened, and so on. And I'm like, okay, great, put that away. And then I missed that, in paragraph 4, it said, so I need an answer to this question. I was really fortunate in the last decade of my university career to have some really great non-autistic people in my team who I could actually ask them to interpret emails. Can you actually read this for me and tell me what it is they want? But that for many of us, we like to, you send me a question, I'll send you an answer. And it's not that I'm trying to be rude or unfriendly or, I just that expecting me to say, "And how are you?" and "I'm well," and "Sunday was lovely." That's not the way that I communicate. I want to help you by giving you the information you need. Other autistic people write really long emails, and I get a lot of people come to me for support with their employers. I've got this problem at work. Can you help me? Because I've got an issue with my supervisor or my colleagues because they're upset about these really, really long emails that I write because they say that I put too much information in. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that every piece of potentially not all the nonsense stuff that neurotypical people sometimes put in there, like the weather and the weekend and how are you having a nice day, but everything that they think might be relevant to the person understanding the particular workplace topic. And then people saying, you're verbose, you're wordy, you need to be clearer. It's important to remember, again, intent. Both of those ways of communicating, whilst they might be difficult and challenging, represent a genuine effort to communicate effectively. So if you're not happy with our communication, give us clear feedback about what it is that you need. Which brings me to my last point, which is feedback. Autistic employees consistently comment, and this is probably one of the biggest things I get from people when they come to me for support, is the lack of regular and timely communication about their progress. So we want to know, are we meeting your expectations? Are we completing the tasks that are required? Where can we improve? And we just want to be acknowledged when we do something right. Often the first that people hear of concerns with their work is when they're disciplined for underperformance or they're let go for not meeting expectations. And that's probably because we're supposed to have picked up all of these subtle, non-verbal little cues or tone of voice or whatever that the boss wasn't happy, and we didn't. But we need that really clear feedback, because if if we're not meeting an expectation, whether it's a work-based one or it's an interaction one or a communication one, we need to know explicitly what it is that isn't working for the organisation so that we understand what it is that you need and we've got an opportunity to work on it. Not, oh dear, we're going to let you go because you didn't do X. And we're like, well, I didn't even know that X was something that you wanted me to do. So I think that's really important, that communication, constant recognition that communication barrier is a two-way issue and that both parties need to work to make sure that they're understanding each other. So that's everything that I wanted to say. That's all my contact information there. So we've got plenty of time for questions. I will just stop sharing my screen.
Okay, and just go very quickly, thanks very much, Staff Sandra, to the very last thing we came up with in the comments from Paul. That's excellent, thank you very much, Sandra. And if only the signs were as clear in French and English as your presentation. So thank you very much for that. Just before we get to the Q&A, there is a couple of questions in there already. But if anybody has any questions or comments for Sandra, now will be a really good time to pop them into the Q&A. But while we're just getting into that, and obviously just Valerie and Beth can be going through those, and we can get to them in a moment. Just a question, just in terms of your presentation, just looking it through from my perspective. Just I'm from ADHD Ireland, like yourself, we get contacts from lots of corporate organisations here in Rhode Island. And one of the things they do talk about, particularly around language, is the worry and concern about getting it wrong. And you know what you see for organisations, just taking the example of the autism sector, and there is this debate in Ireland on a regular basis. And do you refer to someone with autism as a person with autism or an autistic person? And what would you advise organisations in terms of finding the right language for working with people in the workplace?
Personally, I would always say autistic person. That's my strong preference, and that's the predominant consensus in the autistic community is that people prefer autistic person, and that goes back to that issue of my autism is not something I pick up and put down, right? I am a person with a phone, and now I'm not a person with a phone, but I am Australian. That's part of who I am. I am autistic. It impacts every aspect of my life. It's not all that I am. I'm many other things, but it influences the way that I move, the way that I think, the way that I act, the way that I live. And it's not something I'm ashamed of. It's not something I want to separate from myself, but it's something you need to know about me to understand who I am. And it's an intrinsic part of my identity. So, and there's lots of research on preferences, but that would largely be the consensus amongst adults. A lot of parents feel quite differently. A lot of parents will say, my child is not an autistic child, they are a child with autism. So, and the bottom line is the preference of the person you're talking to. If you are a neurotypical person and you have an autistic employee and they say, I want to be called a person with autism, then call them a person with autism. But generally speaking, I would say autistic person.
Have I gone?
Shall I start with a question? Is everybody frozen?
No, I could see everything.
No, everything okay? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think mine froze there for a second. But
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go ahead then with a question, Sandra, from Hugh, who says, as an ADHD person, my communication style can also be tricky for others. One of the benefits of setting up an ND working group in my last employment was to understand the challenges in communication that arose between someone like me as an ADHDer and my autistic colleagues. Some of my autistic colleagues found me more difficult than they found neurotypical colleagues. Having a space where we could talk openly about this was very helpful. We did manage to adjust, but it wasn't always easy. Any thoughts or guidance on this?
That's a great question. I have to say that's something that I find challenging both in the workplace and out of the workplace. So I have many autistic colleagues, I have many ADHD colleagues, I have many autistic ADHD colleagues. I also live in a multiply neurodivergent family. So I'm very aware that the communication styles are very different between many autistic people and many ADHD people. I think you've kind of answered the question yourself, question asker, in that the bottom line is that really getting to know each other and understanding each other's challenges and communication styles, and recognizing that we are different, and really getting back to what are people's intentions, and trying to really understand that we are all coming from a place of trying to be helpful, but recognizing that sometimes we are just going to butt up against each other, you know, and that's real, and that's the world. And how can we actually work around that? How can we understand where each other's coming from, and where can we put those sort of boundaries up in place, and actually be able to say, actually, I find that really difficult. How are we going to find a middle ground where we can work together? How are we going to resolve those issues that make everyone feel comfortable, rather than saying that person has to change? And I think that's what typically happens in the autistic versus neurotypical is, you know, you're the minority, so change. But, you know, I think we have to be realistic that barriers exist between any neurotype, and it's really about trying to be really clear and explicit about what people's intentions are, and how can we find ways of working together without saying to people, you have to change, because we can't change the way that our brains work. We can try and be as considerate of each other's needs as possible.
Sorry, apologies, my internet completely collapsed there. So if I disappear once again, apologies in advance. I've tried the hotspot and that's not working either. And so I'm just being a bit technology challenged this morning. So apologies for that. Just forgive me, we can go to Val just in a sec for the next question, but forgive me, I might be robbing this question. I think this is a great question that came in from Hugh. Do you think that gender preconceptions create additional pressures, especially for women with autism?
Oh, absolutely. Because there are many aspects of autistic communication styles, and even autistic ways of existing styles, that are consistent with the way men are expected to behave in the workplace. And there are many gendered expectations of the way women are supposed to behave in the workplace. So despite the fact that workplaces supposedly have moved on a long way, there is still this expectation that women will be intuitive, that they will pick up on body language, that they will be soft, they will be kind, they will be warm, they will be more effusive in their communications. And so, you know, many autistic women face those challenges around our communication styles are perceived as more blunt, more difficult, less empathetic than male autistics would be. And also, because there is that lack of understanding of female presentations of autism, and even that females can be autistic, there's also that issue that, well, you're not really autistic, you're just a jerk. And so I think there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there around autism and gender.
Oh, I appreciate that. Comes Val for the next question.
Yes, we have a question here from Alexa. She says, Sandra, your presentation and work is so interesting. Thank you very much. So Alexa is autistic and had to leave numerous jobs in her 20s and 30s, not only because of miscommunication between co-workers and herself, but the way public-facing jobs don't protect workers from aggression and anger from the customer. In her experience, the higher the income of the customer, the more badly they behaved, they felt they could be towards her and her colleagues. So could you comment on the impact of capitalism and the customer is always right attitudes on neurodivergent workers, and any suggestions on how to cope with workplace discrimination as a neurodivergent person, and how we can change public perception of neurodivergent communication? So that's quite broad there, but could you comment on the impact of capitalism is the main question, and suggestions on how to cope with discrimination in the workplace.
Okay, so I think the capitalism thing, that's a big issue, and I think a big part of that comes back to the fact that many neurodivergent people are very much more egalitarian, very much more social justice oriented. And so we don't buy into hierarchies in the same way. And I know that's often been a challenge for me in the workplace, this idea that people in positions of power somehow have more right to exist in the world. So whether that power comes from being rich, in your customer example, or whether it comes from being the boss, there is this sort of thing that that person is somehow more valuable than another person, and therefore they can be rude, they can be arrogant, they can be dismissive. And we're supposed to just back down from that. And many autistic people will find that really challenging because, like, no, actually, all people are valid and worthy human beings, and find that really quite distressing and disturbing. And how do I don't, I'll tell you what I usually do, but don't follow my example. If you look at my career path, and I reflect on this a bit in the book, my solution's often been just to leave the job, because I'm like, well, that's just wrong. So I can't handle this injustice. I'm getting out of here. So I'm not recommending people do that. That's, that's not necessarily the best solution. But I think the world has a long way to go, both in terms of the capitalism thing and also in terms of the discrimination, and I can see there's a bit of stuff going in the chat there around, labeling and diagnosis and disclosure. And I think that relates very much to what you're saying here. I would love to live in a world where I say to every autistic person, disclose your diagnosis at work, and the world will be nice to you and people will make life easier and they'll be more understanding and supportive. We do still live in a world where there is a lot of discrimination there. There is not a lot of acceptance of our ways of being in the world, and there is still that very much, oh, well, you as the autistic person are probably wrong in this situation. And there is a lot of discrimination. There's so many barriers to autistic people getting into the workplace, staying in the workplace, and we need such a massive social change that's around addressing those barriers, around not just accepting our different ways of being and that our different ways of being are not wrong, but also seeing our strengths and actually valuing our strengths and recognizing that those strengths that we bring to the workplace more than offset any challenges that we may have in terms of us being different from neurotypical people.
Definitely. Well, sorry, Ken, because you mentioned things like divulging a diagnosis, April did say in the Q&A, your thoughts on that. Now, you've touched on that, and is it usually a good or bad idea in terms of consequences? You can't, I mean, everywhere is going to be different, and somebody in the chat has said that they had a very bad employer, a line manager, who said autistic people are like toddlers and should learn to fit in, which is awful. So, it's unfortunate that, like you say, we're still in a world where the people are going to prejudge. But yes, just on that point of divulging a diagnosis, I mean, if you could maybe expand on that a little bit, or your experience of that.
My experience, I mean, personally, I've been quite fortunate. I would say 95% of the people that I have disclosed to have been really supportive. I mean, for me, disclosing at work was a really positive thing. I was in a very privileged position, right? So, I was in a senior position in an organization. I was very secure where I was working. I had a really good direct manager and a really supportive team around me. So, that all those caveats are really important. I found that the majority of people around, well, I also found that when I disclosed, everyone said, yeah, well, we've already known that for 20 years. So, that probably wasn't that much of a disclosure. I did still find some people that was still sort of, oh, well, you won't be able to do X because you're, and I thought, I could do X yesterday before you knew, and now I can't do it. But I think it's really about understanding the people around you and how supportive or unsupportive those people are, and what is it you are hoping that you will gain from the diagnosis, from the disclosure. What's your workplace like? What are the resources? What are the supports? And really having a clear plan, and that's something that I've kind of really worked on, in terms of when I try to give people advice, I try to give them really practical advice. So I have a chapter in my book about disclosure, but I also have a resource that you can download that's a disclosure plan. So thinking through disclosure, like what are the things to consider? What would you say? Who would you say it to? You know, what are you going to ask for? What are you so because I think that practical aspect is really important, because with disclosure, there's lots of benefits, there's some risks, but the other thing that I say to people, it's a decision you only make once. Right? The decision not to disclose, you can make hundreds of times. The decision to disclose, you make once, because we live in a world of the internet. So, you know, and I'm not saying that to discourage people, because I'd love to have the whole world disclose and show people just how amazingly successful we are and all the things we can do. You know, and I've got a list in the back of my book of 170 successful Australian autistics in a whole range of different careers, just to show, hey, wow, world, look, we can do all these amazing things. And, you know, but I think, you know, that thing, the world that we live in now, it's not the world that we lived in 20 years ago, where you could tell an employer, and if it didn't go so well, you could move to the next employer, right? We now live in a world where you tell someone and the world knows, and, you know, so you've made that decision, you've made it.
Well, I would imagine the roadmap or plan that you mentioned in your book would be hugely helpful then in that regard. So that's great. Thank you.
Just coming up to the hour, so we've got maybe just time for 2 quick questions. And I think Beth had the next one.
Okay, I'm going to go with a question from Yvonne, and it's about resources. So she says, are there good resources and tools to help neurotypical people understand what is experienced as vague? As I think it's hard to judge in the same way it's hard for autistic people to understand when we're being experienced as blunt. She suggests that maybe a translating or evaluation tool is something that AI maybe could do. So I suppose, how do we know what our communication, our downfalls are, as it were? Are there any resources or books or anything that could help us with that?
I would hesitate to say AI, because I've seen people try and use AI for that purpose, but the thing to remember is AI is not a human being, and so the whole point is it's not going to pick up on tone, and it's not going to pick up on all of those other things. For me, the most helpful tool, I mean, I'll say, you know, because I'm self-promotion thing here, I'm going to say buy my first book, because that goes through a lot of that stuff around what's the differences between the way that we think, the way that we communicate. But realistically, the best thing you can do is find a neurotypical friend that you trust, that you get on really well with, that you feel really safe with, and ask them, right? Because it's another human that's going to tell you those things. I know you can use AI, but AI is not as effective as find a neurotypical human who you know is a really good communicator, that you know doesn't have a lot of gets on really well with other people, seems to be able to intuit those things. And when you're feeling really brave, because you've got to be feeling really brave, ask them. I learned so much from that survey I did of my colleagues when I asked, what did you like about working with me? What did you not like about working with me? What were my biggest challenges in the workplace? I actually learned some really positive things that made me feel good, and I learned some things that made me go, oh, ow. So, you know, to me, that's probably the most helpful. You know, as I said, you know, later in my career, I was really fortunate to be able to surround myself with a group of people like that who could read my emails, or, you know, give me advice, not just the ones that came in, but also the ones that, can you read this thing that I've written and tell me if it sounds rude? You know, so to me, another human being is the best tool. You can read lots of books. You can, you know, download lots of resources. All of those things are great, and there are lots of things out there, but nothing replaces another human being who actually understands how you are perceived by other human beings. Like I said, you've got to be brave, but I'd ask a trusted colleague, why is it that I don't get on with other people at work? What is it about me that that they're not getting? And I'm not saying what's wrong with me, because there's nothing wrong with you, but what is it about me that they don't understand, that they're misinterpreting my communication?
And you do have to be brave to do that.
Yeah.
So how do you how do you cope with, or how do you manage it if you get some kind of negative feedback from people?
Like I said, you've got to be brave. I think it's about constantly reminding yourself that it's a context. It's not that you're wrong, it's not that you're bad, it's that you're different. You're not saying what's wrong with me, you're saying what is it about my autistic way of being that is not understood by these non-autistic people, that they are misinterpreting my communication, right? And it's really about recognizing that yes, you are going to get that feedback because you've asked for it, but it is not a criticism of you. It's an explanation of that breakdown. Go back to that slide that I had with the signs, right? You wouldn't be saying to the French person, this is a criticism of you as a French person. It's like, why you're a crappy French person. That's not the question. The question is, people don't understand you because you haven't quite mastered the English accent, right? Or because you're using the wrong verbs, or you're using the nouns in the wrong way. That's what we're talking about here, right? So to me, that's the way that you manage it, is remembering that it's not a criticism of you as a human being. It's an explanation of how your style of existence and communication is different to the majority and why that's happening.
Okay, thanks very much. That we're just coming up just past 6 o'clock, so I'm afraid we've reached our time. So thank you very much to Sandra Thom Jones, Professor Sandra Thom Jones. She has a new book out, as we were saying. So Autistic at Work came out last week, so available in all good book clubs. Thanks to everybody for contributing via the chat. There's been lots of rich content going through there. We really appreciate that. Thanks to everybody putting questions in. Thanks to Val and Beth for fielding the questions there. Thanks for the internet for staying going for the last couple of minutes. Just to let you know, so thank you very much for coming along today. We really appreciate it. We're back on the 23rd of October at 5 p.m. We've John Marble, who's the author of Neurodiversity for Dummies, the normalcy of neurodiversity. And so again, I think we're coming out of here today. You may have a friend who might need to come along. One of our neurotypicals who might need a little bit more education, so this would be specifically designed for them. So do pass it on if you think you could have someone who would benefit from that. So thank you to everybody for coming along today. Really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. And just once again, thanks to Professor Sandra Thom Jones for the wonderful presentation and for answering all the questions so succinctly. And we look forward to seeing you all again very shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.